Hey there, so today we're kicking off a brand new journey through the Bible, and we're diving into the book of Romans. Yep, right after Acts. And it's written by Paul, one of the most fascinating letters in the New Testament. Now, here's the interesting twist. Even though it comes after Acts in the Bible, Paul actually wrote it years before he even set foot in Rome. Crazy, right? We're going to explore why that matters and who he was writing to. Let's jump in and see what's going on here. Alright, let's set the stage a little bit for the book of Romans, because understanding the context really changes how we read it. So, picture Paul, the apostle, in the city of Corinth around 57 or 58 AD. Yeah, that's right, he's writing this letter to the church in Rome. But here's the kicker, he hasn't even been there yet. He's never met most of the people he's writing to. Imagine sending a long, heartfelt letter to a group of people you barely know. That's exactly what Paul is doing here. Now, why is this important? Well, the church in Rome wasn't like the ones Paul had planted himself. Usually, when Paul went on his missionary journeys, he would visit a city, establish a church, spend some time teaching and mentoring them, and then send letters to encourage them or address specific issues. Romans is different. He didn't plant this church. He had never walked the streets of Rome as a missionary, never seen their faces in a synagogue or a home gathering, never shared a meal or prayed alongside them. So, this letter is, in a way, an introduction. Paul is connecting with a church he knows from a distance. A community he's aware of but hasn't personally nurtured. So how did this church even come to be? That's another interesting twist. The church in Rome was made up of a mix of Jewish and Gentile believers. The Jewish members were likely people who had traveled to Jerusalem for Pentecost. Remember the great harvest in Acts 2. Many Jews who went there got saved during that incredible movement of the Spirit and then returned to Rome. They carried the gospel with them and started gathering believers. And the Gentiles, often referred to as Greeks in the text, were local Romans who had come to believe in Jesus. So already, yes, you've got this mixed Jews steeped in God's law and with a background of scripture and worship practices, alongside Gentiles who had little to no knowledge of God, coming from a polytheistic culture. Think about the potential tension there. One group has a deep-rooted sense of tradition and law. The other is just beginning to explore the concept of a single God who actually cares about them. And this is where the context becomes crucial. Paul isn't just writing theology for the sake of it. He's writing to a community that has to navigate these cultural differences. You've got Jewish believers who are familiar with scripture, moral codes, and religious rituals. You've got Gentiles who are new to the faith without that background, often coming from completely different cultural and moral frameworks. And yet, Paul is laying the groundwork for unity. He's showing them that the gospel of Jesus Christ is big enough to bring these two groups together. It's not about one culture dominating another. It's about both standing under the lordship of Christ. That's significant because it's exactly the kind of challenge churches face even today. And understanding that tension helps us appreciate why Paul emphasizes certain themes in the letter, like justification by faith, grace, and the universality of God's salvation. So let's picture Corinth for a moment, where Paul is when he writes Romans. Corinth was a bustling, cosmopolitan city full of trade, diversity, and, let's be honest, moral chaos by first century standards. It's the perfect place for Paul to reflect on the broader issues facing the Roman church. He's not writing from a small, tight-knit village. He's in a major urban center, seeing people from all walks of life, all sorts of beliefs, and cultures colliding. This gives him a perspective that's broad and deeply insightful. When he writes to the Romans, he's speaking to a complex audience, not just a single group that thinks alike. He's addressing challenges that come from blending different backgrounds, beliefs, and practices, and he's doing it in a way that's thoughtful, pastoral, and profoundly strategic. And here's another layer. Even though Paul hasn't met the Roman believers personally, he does know some of them by reputation. At the end of the letter, he lists about 26 names friends, fellow workers, perhaps some people who have been instrumental in spreading the gospel in Rome. So he's not writing in a vacuum. He's aware of who's there, what their needs might be, and the dynamics of the community, at least to some degree. He's writing with intention, with foresight, And with a lot of spiritual insight, it's kind of like sending a care package with a detailed note you haven't seen them in person, but you know them enough to know exactly what they need. Now, let's talk about the significance of this Jewish and Gentile mix a bit more because it really shapes the content of Romans. The Jewish believers came with a history of God's promises, a sense of covenant, and familiarity with the law. They understood concepts like sin, sacrifice, and atonement, at least in a traditional sense. They had been taught that God was righteous and that humanity needed to be holy. Then you've got the Gentiles, who didn't have that background. Their worldview was shaped by Roman and Greek polytheism, and many had lived under the assumption that morality was flexible, determined by culture or practicality rather than divine law. Now suddenly, both groups are under the same roof, following the same Savior. That's a lot to navigate. Paul's letter addresses this head on, explaining how God's plan through Jesus is for all people, Jews and Gentiles alike, and that faith, not works or heritage, is the key to righteousness. He's essentially giving them the playbook for unity and mutual understanding, and he's doing it in a way that transcends cultural backgrounds. And that's where the genius of Paul comes in. He doesn't just write abstract theology, he writes with a clear understanding of human nature, culture, and relationships. He knows that the Roman Church could easily fracture along cultural lines if they don't grasp the principles of grace and faith. So, while he's laying out doctrines that will later influence the entire Christian world, he's also solving practical problems in real time. He's speaking into the reality of a mixed community, helping them see that their differences don't divide them, they're united under Christ. That's a big deal, especially considering how often humans struggle with unity across cultural lines. Another thing to note is the timing. Paul writes this letter in Corinth, which is 3 years before he actually arrives in Rome. That means he's writing to prepare the ground, to establish a theological framework before he even sets foot there. He's creating a foundation for understanding the gospel, grace, and faith so that when he finally arrives, he's not starting from scratch. The Roman believers already have a sense of the key truths he wants to communicate. That's strategic. And it also shows how much Paul cares about ensuring that the gospel takes root in hearts and minds, not just in routines or rituals. And let's not forget the bigger picture. The book of Romans is unique among Paul's letters because he isn't addressing a specific problem or conflict in the church. Most of his letters tackle issues like disputes between members, moral failures, or theological confusion. Romans is different. It's more like a masterclass in theology, yet still incredibly practical. It's meant to unify, educate, and inspire. And understanding the context, the Jewish and Gentile mix, the lack of Paul's personal presence, the cosmopolitan Corinthian backdrop helps us see why he emphasizes certain themes. The letter isn't just abstract ideas, it's a carefully crafted tool for building a diverse, culturally complex church. So, when we read Romans, it's important to remember this context. We're not just reading a theological treatise written in isolation. We're reading a letter from a passionate apostle to a church he cares deeply about. A church made up of different people, different backgrounds, and different experiences. He's bridging gaps, clarifying misunderstandings, and pointing them to the truth that transcends culture, Jesus Christ. He's teaching them that faith is the great equalizer, that grace is for everyone, and that the gospel has the power to unite people who might otherwise be divided. And that's still relevant today. Understanding the historical and cultural context isn't just academic, it actually helps us hear the message the way Paul intended, to see the struggles, the tensions, and the triumphs of a real church trying to live out the gospel in a complicated world. So as we go through Romans together, keep this context in mind. Remember Paul in Corinth, writing to a church he hadn't visited, a church full of both Jews and Gentiles, trying to navigate cultural differences and understand God's plan for salvation. That background colors every chapter, every verse, and every word. It helps us appreciate why Paul stresses faith, grace, and unity. It helps us understand the weight of his words, the heart behind the letter, and the practical application for life and community. And it sets the stage perfectly for the rest of our study. And because once we know who Paul is writing to and why, everything he says about the gospel, about God's grace, and about faith starts to make even more sense. Okay, now let's talk about what makes the book of Romans really stand out compared to Paul's other letters. Most of Paul's letters were written to address specific problems or challenges in the churches he had founded or visited. For example, in Corinthians, he's dealing with divisions, moral failures, and disputes over spiritual gifts. In Galatians, he's addressing false teachers and legalism creeping into the community. Even in Philippians, he's encouraging unity and warning against people who might cause trouble. Romans, though, is different. Romans isn't about solving a local problem or putting out a fire. It's not a response to a crisis, and it's not correcting behavior, at least not primarily. Instead, Romans is more like a big picture masterclass. Paul is laying out God's plan of redemption for all humanity, and he's doing it with depth and clarity that you really don't see anywhere else. He's writing to a church he hasn't planted, to people he hasn't personally mentored, and yet he dives into the heart of the gospel with precision and passion. This gives Romans a unique feel. It's not reactive, it's proactive. Paul isn't just telling people how to behave or fixing their mistakes. He's giving them the framework to understand the gospel at the deepest level. He's explaining why Jesus came, what salvation is, and how God's grace works in our lives. And that's important because the Roman church is diverse. It's made up of Jews and Gentiles, people with backgrounds steeped in scripture and people with none. So Paul starts from the foundations and builds up. He's ensuring that everyone has the same understanding of God's plan, that no one is left confused or misled, and that the whole church can stand on the same theological ground. That's pretty remarkable if you think about it. It's like he's writing a theology course in the form of a letter. Now, when we talk about Romans, there are three words you really need to pay attention to: gospel, grace, and faith. These aren't just random terms that happen to pop up. They are the heartbeat of the letter. Let's start with gospel. You've probably heard that word a lot. Gospel literally means good news, and in the context of Romans, it's the good news about Jesus Christ. And Paul emphasizes that the gospel isn't about our ability to perform or follow rules perfectly. It's about what Jesus has already done. It's about the message that through him, we can be reconciled to God. That's powerful because it flips the way many people think about religion. Instead of trying to earn God's favor or constantly worrying about falling short, the gospel says, no. The work has been done. Trust in this truth. In Romans, Paul mentions the gospel repeatedly because he wants the readers to see that all of God's redemptive plan flows through this one good news. It's not peripheral, it's central. Then there's grace. Grace is a word that gets tossed around a lot, but in Romans, it has a very specific weight. It's the idea of God's undeserved favor, basically. God giving us what we don't deserve. Think of it like a gift you could never earn, a gift that comes purely out of God's love and mercy. Paul mentions grace more than in any other New Testament book, and for good reason. The Roman believers, especially the Jews, were familiar with the idea of law and obligation. They knew about obedience and rules, and it could be easy to slip into the mindset that you have to perform to earn God's approval. Paul is cutting through that by emphasizing that salvation is rooted in grace. God's favor isn't something we work for, it's something we receive. And when you combine that with the gospel, it creates a revolutionary understanding Jesus' death and resurrection is sufficient, and we don't need to add anything to it to be made right with God. Finally, we have faith. Faith is another cornerstone of Romans, and it's tied closely to both the gospel and grace. Faith, in Paul's writing, isn't just believing something abstract, it's trust, reliance, and confidence in God's promises. It's believing that what he says about Jesus and salvation is true, and acting on that trust. Faith is what connects us to God's grace through the gospel. Without faith, grace might be offered but never received. And Paul emphasizes this because the Romans, like anyone, guys, could easily fall into thinking that moral effort, cultural background, or heritage could earn them salvation. Faith shifts the focus entirely onto God and what he has accomplished. It's the bridge between God's gift and our experience of it. What's really interesting is how these three words, gospel, grace, and faith, intertwine throughout the letter. Paul isn't just dropping theological terms for the sake of sounding smart. He's weaving them into the narrative of redemption, showing the Roman church how each piece fits into the bigger picture. The gospel tells them what God has done. Grace explains why they can't earn it and why God's favor is freely given. Faith demonstrates how they receive it, when it's a seamless chain gospel, grace, faith, all connecting to the central theme of salvation and righteousness through Christ. And here's where the practical side comes in. Romans isn't just theology to argue about in the abstract, and Paul wants the readers to understand these truths so they can live them out. Understanding the gospel, grace, and faith isn't just for knowledge, it's for transformation. The Roman believers are in a city full of competing ideas, philosophies, and moral pressures. They're navigating a diverse and sometimes morally confusing environment, just like any church in a cosmopolitan city today. Paul equips them with these foundational truths so that no matter what cultural or personal pressures come their way, they can stand firm. They know why Jesus came, they understand God's favor, and they trust in God's promises. That's powerful because it provides both clarity and stability in a complicated world. Another thing that makes Romans unique is the way Paul systematically lays everything out. He's not jumping around, he's building a case. He starts with the universality of sin, explains God's wrath, introduces justification through faith, and then moves into practical implications for living in community. That structure is intentional. It's not random, it's pedagogical. Paul wants the Romans to see the logic, the coherence, and the beauty of God's redemptive plan. And because he's dealing with a church that's culturally mixed, this clarity is essential. Without it, misunderstandings could easily cause conflict between Jews and Gentiles, between those familiar with the law and those new to faith. Romans lays the foundation for unity by showing that everyone, regardless of background, is saved the same way through faith in Jesus Christ and the grace of God. We also have to remember the emotional and pastoral tone. Even though Paul is writing theology, it's not dry or detached. He's deeply invested in these people. He loves them, even from a distance. You can sense his passion and care in the way he writes. He's not just laying out doctrine, he's inviting them into a relationship with God that is transformative. That's why Romans is so enduring. It's both profoundly theological and profoundly personal. It's teaching, encouragement, and pastoral guidance all wrapped into one letter. And here's a fun thing to think about, because Paul is writing to a church he hasn't planted and hasn't met. He has to be thorough. There's no back and forth, no chance to clarify immediately. That means Romans is packed with explanation, argument, and reassurance. He's anticipating questions, misunderstandings, and objections. That's why Romans reads almost like a book-length sermon or a theological blueprint. He's covering the gospel, grace, and faith in ways that are comprehensive and clear, ensuring that even without his presence, the Roman believers can understand the core truths and live by them. So when you read Romans, don't just skim over it like any other letter. Pause and notice how intentional Paul is. Every chapter, every paragraph, every key term is chosen to guide the church into a deeper understanding of God's plan. The gospel isn't just mentioned, it's unpacked. Grace isn't just a word, it's a lifeline. Faith isn't just an idea, it's a daily reliance on God's promises. And when you keep that in mind, you start to see Romans not just as a letter, but as a roadmap to living a faith-filled life, rooted in God's redemptive plan, for people of all backgrounds and cultures. So, to wrap this section up, Romans stands out because it's not reactive, it's foundational. It addresses the big picture of God's redemption, not local church drama. The keywords gospel, grace, and faith aren't just concepts. They're the framework for everything Paul wants the Romans to understand and live by. And understanding these words and how they interconnect is crucial to appreciating the rest of the letter. This is why Romans has had such a lasting impact throughout church history and why it continues to speak powerfully to believers today. It's a masterful blend of theology and pastoral care, designed to unite, educate, and inspire a diverse group of believers. That's the brilliance of Romans, and it's why studying it carefully is so worthwhile. Alright, now let's talk about the huge impact the book of Romans has had throughout history. Because it's not just a letter to an ancient church, it's a book that literally changed lives and shaped the course of Christianity. Take Augustine, for example, back in 386 AD. Augustine was a young man wrestling with doubts, questions, and a lot of spiritual confusion. He writes about how reading Romans was like a floodlight going off in his heart. He said it cleared away all the darkness of doubt and uncertainty. Imagine being lost in a fog and suddenly someone flips on a huge, bright light. That's what Romans did for him. He could finally see the clarity of God's grace, the simplicity of trusting in Christ, and the freedom that comes from faith. That one book transformed the way he understood God, sin, and salvation, and ultimately, it shaped his entire life. Fast forward a little over 1,000 years to Martin Luther in the early 1500s. Luther, he was an Augustinian monk, and he was completely burdened by the idea that he had to earn God's favor. He wrestled with the law of works and the constant pressure to be good enough. And then he encounters Romans, and here's where the story gets really fascinating. Luther keeps coming back to one phrase, the righteousness of God. He originally thought it meant God's own righteousness, like God punishing the unrighteous. But as he studied Romans, especially chapters 1 through 3, he realized that it actually refers to the righteousness God gives us through faith. By grace. It's not about what we do, it's about what God has done for us in Christ. Luther writes that this understanding made him feel reborn, like he had passed through open doors into paradise. Can you imagine that moment? One book, one letter, changing someone's whole worldview, enough that he goes on to challenge centuries of church teaching and launches the Protestant Reformation. Romans, for Luther, was more than a book. It was a revelation that shook the foundations of Christianity at the time. Then we have John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement. In the 18th century, he tells this story himself. In 1738, he reads Romans and experiences what he calls his heart being strangely warmed. He felt a deep, personal assurance that Christ had taken his sins away. Even sins he thought were too great, even sins he felt trapped by. He realized he could be forgiven. Wesley describes it as a moment of both emotional and spiritual awakening. He literally felt his life transformed by understanding Romans, by grasping the reality of grace and faith. That one letter helped him understand salvation in a deeply personal way, and it fueled the spread of Methodism across England and beyond. What's so striking about all these stories, Augustine, Luther, Wesley, is how Romans consistently directs the reader to the heart of the gospel. It's not just rules, not just doctrine, not just theory. It's life-changing. It's personal. It connects people to God's grace in a way that feels immediate, tangible, and liberating. Each of these figures encountered Romans in a moment of need, in a time of searching or spiritual burden, and it spoke right into that moment. It showed them that faith is the way to embrace the gift God offers, that grace is there even when we can't earn it, and that the gospel is real, powerful, and transformative. And here's a fun thing to think about. Even though Paul wrote Romans nearly 2,000 years ago to a specific church in a very specific context, its message is timeless. Augustine in North Africa, Luther in Germany, Wesley in England, all thousands of miles and centuries apart, experienced the same core truths. That's the genius of Romans. Paul wrote a letter to explain God's plan of redemption in a way that transcends culture, time, and place. And the fact that it's had such a profound impact on history shows how powerful these truths are when they hit a heart ready to receive them. So, when we read Romans today, we're not just reading for knowledge. We're reading a book that has a track record of changing lives, challenging long-held assumptions, and opening hearts to grace, faith, and the gospel. It's a book that's personal, practical, and transformative. And knowing these historical stories gives us a sense of the weight of Paul's words and the potential they have to speak into our own lives as well. Okay. Now let's get into the heart of Romans, the part that really makes this letter so life-changing, the good news. And when I say good news, I mean the gospel in its simplest, most powerful form, salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. Not by what you do, not by how many good deeds you can rack up, not even by how perfectly you try to live your life. Nope. It's all about what Jesus has already done for us on the cross. That's the big idea, and it's repeated over and over in Romans because Paul wants everyone to get it. Let's be honest, a lot of people get this wrong, right? We're naturally wired to think, if I just try harder, do better, be good enough, God will approve of me. I mean, haven't we all done that at some point? You try to be the perfect employee, the perfect parent, the perfect friend, and you think, maybe if I get it all right, God will be happy with me. But Paul comes in and says, nope, that's not how it works. Grace is the key word here. Grace is God's undeserved favor. It's like the ultimate gift you can't earn, can't deserve, and can't work your way into. Think of it as God saying, I love you, I forgive you, and you don't have to pay me back. It's mind-blowing. Really, when you stop and think about it. And here's the thing, Romans keeps hammering this point because humans are stubborn. We like to add to the gift. We're like, okay, thanks for the free car, God. But if I polish it for 6 months straight, will that make it even better? That's not how grace works. The moment you try to earn it, you're actually missing the point. Paul wants the Roman believers and us to understand that salvation isn't about what we do. It's about what Christ has done. And this is why Romans is so revolutionary. It levels the playing field. Jew, Gentile, rich, poor, learned, unlearned, it doesn't matter. The gospel of Jesus Christ is for everyone, and everyone receives it the same way by faith. Faith in this context isn't just a vague feeling or a casual belief. It's trust, reliance, and confidence in God's promises. It's like saying, I can't fix this myself, but I know Jesus has already fixed it for me. That's what connects us to God's grace. And Paul repeats it again and again because he wants the Romans to grasp it fully. He knows it's easy to misunderstand or slip back into the I gotta earn it mindset. So he keeps pointing them and us back to faith. It's not about jumping through hoops. It's about responding to the gift God freely gives. Now, let's make this a little relatable. Imagine you're at a restaurant and the waiter brings your meal. You didn't cook it, you didn't pay for it, but you sit down and enjoy it. You could say, well, I'll wash the dishes later. Maybe I can earn it, but the meal is already yours to enjoy. That's grace. And faith is the confidence to eat it without doubting whether you've done enough to deserve it. Romans is basically telling us, God has prepared the feast, and all you need to do is accept it. And here's the really freeing part. Once you get this, it changes everything. Life isn't about constantly trying to prove yourself to God. Instead, it becomes about responding to His gift, living in gratitude, and letting that grace shape how you interact with others. It's liberating. No more carrying the impossible burden of perfection. Instead, you live knowing that God has done the heavy lifting, and your role is to walk in trust and faith. So, the core good news of Romans boils down to this. Jesus died for our sins. We are forgiven, and we can't earn it because it's already a gift. Grace is free. Faith is our response. And together they open the door to a relationship with God that's unshakable, life-changing, and available to everyone. That's the beauty of Romans, and why it's called the good news because, well, it really is good news. Alright, so we've talked about the good news, and now if you really want to grasp the full picture of Romans, we need to talk about the other side of the coin, the bad news. And yes, I mean bad news. Paul doesn't waste any time in the first few chapters laying this out, and he does it for a very important reason. You can't fully appreciate the good news without understanding the bad. Think about it like medicine. If the doctor didn't tell you what's wrong, you wouldn't really value the cure. And Romans is kind of like a spiritual diagnosis, showing humanity's condition before presenting the remedy. So what exactly is the bad news? At the heart of it, it's humanity's sin and the reality of God's wrath. And here's a word we need to pause on for a second: wrath. Now, when we hear that word, we might think of a scary, angry God who just wants to zap people at random. But Paul is precise. Wrath here refers to God's righteous anger, His holy indignation, His justice in response to human sin. It's not arbitrary, it's a reflection of God's perfect character. When Paul talks about God's wrath, he's saying this is serious. Sin is serious, you can't just brush it off. And understanding this is key, because without it, the good news, grace to forgiveness, faith loses its weight. If there were no consequences for sin, if God just looked the other way, then forgiveness wouldn't be needed, right? There wouldn't even be a gospel, but there is, because sin has real consequences, and God's holiness demands justice. Paul goes even further and makes it clear that all of humanity falls under this reality, no exceptions. The Bible repeatedly says that all have sinned. Romans doesn't tiptoe around it. It's not just the bad people who are guilty, or the obviously immoral. Every single human being is included in the sweep of sin. That's why understanding our own guilt is so crucial. We need to see that on our own, left to ourselves. We're in a hopeless situation, and this is the backdrop against which the gospel shines. It's the reason grace is so necessary, the reason faith matters. If you don't recognize the depth of the problem, you can't fully appreciate the solution. Now, Paul doesn't just lump everyone together without nuance. In chapters 1 and 2, he outlines 3 categories that capture the various ways people relate to God, and they're all, unfortunately, problematic. The first category he talks about is the unrighteous. These are people who have no knowledge of God, who ignore his existence, and who live as though he doesn't matter. Paul makes it clear that God has revealed himself to everyone through creation, through the world around us. So there's no excuse. Nature itself testifies to God's power and divine order. So the unrighteous, even though they might say, "I didn't know," they've suppressed the truth that's been made evident to them. It's kind of like seeing the warning signs on a cliff, but choosing to ignore them. And Paul wants us to recognize that this isn't just historical commentary, it's real, even today. People suppress God's truth because they want to live their lives on their own terms. Then there's the self-righteous. These are the folks who think, well, I know God exists, and I'm following the rules. I'm good. I've got this covered. Maybe they pride themselves on morality, heritage, or religious observance. And here's the kicker: Paul points out that self-righteousness doesn't excuse anyone. Being aware of God's standards and still failing to measure up is actually a greater offense. It's like being given the full instructions and still choosing to ignore them. Self-righteousness can be a sneaky form of pride because it masks the heart problem. On the outside, it looks virtuous, but on the inside, it's still a failure to acknowledge the need for God's grace. Finally, there's what Paul calls the over-righteous. This one is a little less obvious, but just as critical. These are people who know God and maybe even try to follow him, but they're self-reliant. They trust in their own efforts or their own understanding to achieve righteousness. Maybe they're religious leaders, teachers, or devout practitioners who think their actions justify them. And Paul makes it clear that all of these categories are insufficient on their own. Human effort, morality, knowledge, or observance cannot bridge the gap created by sin. In every case, the result is the same: God's wrath is deserved. The over-righteous are still guilty, even if they don't realize it, because the standard isn't just outward behavior, it's the condition of the heart and reliance on God. And Paul doesn't leave it there. He shows how God has revealed himself to each of these categories in a way that's fair and just. For the unrighteous, it's creation and nature. For the self-righteous, it's the law and conscience. For the over-righteous, it's the responsibility of knowing the truth and still relying on self rather than God. In every case, God's justice is evident. People are without excuse, and this sets up the tension that makes the gospel so essential. Without understanding that everyone is under God's wrath, that all humanity is guilty in one way or another, the gift of grace and the call to faith would be meaningless. It would be like offering life preservers to people who don't realize they're drowning. Paul spends the first 3 chapters of Romans carefully establishing this reality because it's foundational. You can't skip it. You can't jump straight to the good news without understanding the bad news. He lays it all out: human sin, God's wrath, the universality of guilt, and the different ways people fail to honor God, so that when he finally talks about justification, grace, and faith, the reader fully grasps the depth of God's mercy. It's dramatic, yes, but it's necessary. And Paul does it in a way that's direct and, at times, shocking. He doesn't sugarcoat the problem because he wants the solution, the gospel, to land with full impact. So as we read Romans, it's important to pause and take this seriously. Think about your own life, your own tendencies, the ways you've ignored God or relied on yourself. Paul is setting the stage for understanding why we need salvation so desperately. And here's the beautiful part, because the bad news is so stark, the good news shines even brighter. Grace isn't just a nice extra, it's the only thing that can rescue us. Faith isn't optional, it's the bridge to life. And the gospel isn't theoretical, it's the answer to the very real problem of sin and the wrath of God. So when Paul talks about the unrighteous, self-righteous, and over-righteous, he's not just categorizing people for fun. He's illustrating the ways every human being, in one way or another, falls short of God's perfect standard. And he's showing that the problem is universal, inescapable, and serious. But he's also preparing us to see the hope, because once we recognize the depth of the problem, once we understand the gravity of sin and the reality of God's wrath, we can fully appreciate the incredible gift of salvation through Christ. Without this context, grace loses its brilliance, faith loses its significance, and the gospel loses its power. So, Paul lays out the bad news not to scare or condemn us for the sake of it, but to awaken us to our need. He's painting a clear picture of humanity's condition so that when the good news comes, it hits with life-altering force. And that's exactly what Romans does. It diagnoses the problem with brutal honesty, but also points toward the solution with unmatched clarity and hope. And that's the genius of it. Understanding the bad news is not just helpful, it's essential for appreciating why the gospel is, without question, the best news any of us could ever receive. Okay, now we're diving deep into Romans 1:18 to 25, and this is where Paul really hits the nail on the head about humanity's condition apart from God. He's talking about the unrighteous, here people who suppress the truth. And when Paul says suppress, he doesn't mean they can't see it. No. They do see it, but they choose to ignore it. It's like staring at a stop sign while speeding down the highway and thinking, yeah, I don't need that today. The truth is right there. But for one reason or another, they push it aside. Paul goes on to explain that God has revealed himself through creation. This is key because it means that no one can claim complete ignorance. God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen and understood through the world around us. Think about it. Look at the universe for a second. The complexity of the solar system alone is staggering. The Earth spins on its axis at about 1,000 miles an hour while hurtling around the sun at 67,000 miles per hour, all without flying off into space. And somehow, everything stays in balance. Have you ever stopped and just thought, wow, this is precise beyond belief. That's God's handiwork. And Paul says, if all of this exists, humans are without excuse. You literally have to work hard to miss it. And it's not just the macro level stuff. Even at a human level, the design is mind-blowing. Take the human heart, for instance. It's roughly the size of your fist, weighs about half a pound, and yet in just 12 hours, it does enough work to lift 65 tons off the ground. I mean, think about that. That's like the strongest weightlifter on earth working non-stop while never stopping for a break. And what about the blood vessels if you laid them out? They'd cover over a mile in length. Nerve endings, sweat glands, cells. The human body is a system so complex, so intricately connected, that it screams intelligent design. Yet some people look at all of this and just shrug and say, yeah, that happened by accident over millions of years. Really, that takes more faith than believing in God. Paul's point here is that creation itself testifies to God. Nature is like a billboard screaming, I exist, pay attention. And yet, people still suppress the truth. Why? Because acknowledging God means accountability. And the unrighteous want to live life their own way without considering God's authority. So they look at the evidence, see the handiwork, and consciously turn away. They exchange the truth for a lie, worshiping the created rather than the creator. And this is where we run into what Paul calls inverted priorities. Humans, instead of honoring God who made everything, start worshiping the creation itself. It could be the sun, the moon, the sea, or even a high-tech gadget. Sometimes it's our own accomplishments or possessions. Basically, anything can become an idol if it takes God's rightful place in our lives. And Paul is clear: when you put the created thing before the Creator, it's a serious misstep. It might feel harmless, like admiring a beautiful sunset or enjoying a powerful computer. But if those things become the center of your devotion, you've inverted the natural order. God designed us to honor Him, not the tools, technology, or even nature itself. The Bible is blunt here. Worshipping the creation is exactly the problem that leads to humanity's rebellion. Let's make this relevant to today. Look around, people obsess over the environment, which is good in itself. Don't get me wrong, but sometimes it overshadows bigger priorities. We recycle, reduce our carbon footprint, and save sea turtles, which is noble, but at the same time, we might ignore spiritual realities, the moral lives of people, or the very existence of God. It's a form of idolatry in plain sight. Worshipping creation rather than Creator is still happening, just with a modern twist. Paul's words from 2,000 years ago still cut right to the heart of our culture now. Paul also dives into why humans are without excuse. Verse 20 is amazing. It says that God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen and understood through what has been made. So people are without excuse. That's huge. Even if someone claims, "I didn't know God existed," Paul says, nope. Creation itself has revealed Him. You can't claim ignorance. From the tiniest atom to the vast galaxy, from the human eye to the ecosystem of a rainforest, everything points back to a Creator. It's like trying to claim you didn't notice the sun rising every morning. You know it's there. It's just a matter of how you respond, and yet, the unrighteous suppress the truth. They exchange God's glory for something else. Maybe it's pleasure, maybe power, maybe prestige, whatever it is, it takes the place of God. The consequences follow naturally. Paul explains that when people make this exchange, they're no longer in alignment with the order God set. No, they're darkened in their understanding. Their hearts become foolish, and they fall into a kind of spiritual chaos. It's not just moral failure, it's a misalignment with reality itself. God has made Himself known through creation, and yet the unrighteous choose to ignore it. They are, by choice, living contrary to God's design. And here's a picture for you. Think about a beautifully constructed watch. Every gear, every spring, every tiny piece is meticulously designed to keep perfect time. Now imagine someone takes that watch and worships the casing instead of respecting the craftsmanship that made it all work. That's what Paul is saying. The universe, life, and everything in it are like that watch. To ignore the Creator and focus solely on the creation is backwards. It might seem natural or even reasonable in our own eyes, but it's an inversion of reality. Creation is supposed to point us to God, not replace Him. And when that happens on a massive scale, you've got widespread idolatry and moral confusion, which Paul labels as unrighteousness. Even in everyday life, we see echoes of this. People obsess over social media, celebrity culture, wealth, or status. They can admire nature or technology, which is fine. But when it becomes the ultimate pursuit, the ultimate measure of worth or happiness, they've inverted priorities. God created all of these things, but they were never meant to be objects of worship. Romans 1 is still strikingly relevant. Humans have always had this tendency to suppress the truth in favor of what's immediate, visible, or seemingly powerful. Paul's message is clear. The unrighteous have no excuse. God has revealed Himself to all through creation. The complexity of the cosmos, the intricacy of the human body, the order of the natural world, all these things are evidence of His existence, power, and divine nature. And yet, people choose to ignore it, suppress it, or replace it with idols of their own making. That suppression is serious because it demonstrates a deliberate turning away from God. It's not just ignorance, it's willful rejection. And understanding this helps us see why humans need redemption so desperately, which sets the stage for the gospel of grace and faith that Paul lays out later. So, Romans 1:18-25 isn't just ancient text, it's a mirror. It shows us the human condition, the danger of ignoring God, and the consequences of worshiping creation instead of the Creator. It's a call to recognize the evidence of God in everything around us, and to respond appropriately, not with indifference, but with awe, obedience, and faith. And in the process, it helps us understand why the good news of the gospel is not optional, it's necessary. The unrighteous suppressing the truth is serious business, but the remedy through Christ is even more remarkable. That's why this passage is so foundational for everything that follows in Romans. Alright, now let's bring everything together and connect the bad news with the good news. And here's where Romans 5:8-9 really comes into play. Now Paul writes, "But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him." Isn't that incredible? The bad news is clear. All of humanity is guilty, unrighteous, and under the reality of God's wrath. But the good news, the gospel, flips the story completely. Even while we were in that state, even while we were suppressing the truth and living contrary to God's design, Christ stepped in. He paid the price we could never pay and opened the door for salvation. That's grace in its purest, most radical form. This is why understanding the bad news is so crucial. If we skip over the severity of sin, the reality of human guilt, or the righteousness of God's wrath, the gospel can start to sound like a vague idea or just a nice thought. But when we see the depth of the problem, our rebellion, our brokenness, our inability to fix ourselves, the solution becomes breathtakingly clear. Jesus didn't die for the righteous. He died for sinners. He didn't wait for us to clean up our act. He stepped into the mess, offering forgiveness, mercy, and a path to life through faith. It's like the weight of our guilt and failure makes the love and grace of Christ shine all the brighter. You can't fully grasp one without the other. The bad news is the context, the setup, the reason the good news is not just relevant, but essential, and that's where faith comes in. Faith isn't a backup plan or a small part of the equation, it's the bridge that connects us to this incredible gift. We respond to God's grace with trust, believing that what Christ has done is sufficient. We don't add to it. We don't try to earn it. We simply accept it. Romans shows us that salvation is not about us. It's about Him. It's not about our achievements, our morality, or our knowledge. It's about Christ's finished work. And the beauty of this is that it applies to everyone. Jew, Gentile, learned, unlearned, guilty, or even confused. It's for all who believe. So when we reflect on the first chapters of Romans, all the talk about sin, unrighteousness, and God's wrath isn't meant to condemn us indefinitely. It's meant to make us aware, to wake us up to our need for a savior. And once we see that need, the good news hits differently. Grace isn't just a nice idea, it's the lifeline. Faith isn't optional. It's the way we step into the salvation that Christ has already made available. The bad news makes the good news not just understandable, but urgent and precious. As we move forward in this series, keep that connection in mind. Every time we talk about faith, grace, or the gospel, remember why it matters. It's not abstract theology. It's the remedy for the human condition. It's the reason we have hope, the reason we can experience freedom, and the reason we can be reconciled with God. Romans teaches us that we were lost, we were guilty, and yet, in the midst of it all, God made a way. That's worth pausing for a moment to let sink in. And here's a gentle invitation: stick with this series. As we continue through Romans, we'll unpack more about faith, grace, and how the gospel works in practical life. We'll explore the freedom it brings, the challenges it addresses, and the hope it provides. The first chapters might feel heavy with the bad news, but always remember they set the stage for the incredible good news of Christ's love and sacrifice. Let that truth settle into your heart. Let it inspire curiosity, reflection, and gratitude. So, take a moment to reflect on Romans 5:8-9. Picture it while we were still sinners. Christ died for us. That's grace. That's mercy. That's love beyond measure. And because of that, we can be justified, saved, and spared from the wrath we deserve. That's not just a theological point, it's life-changing. And the more we understand both the bad news and the good news, the more we can appreciate the richness of God's plan. Keep following along, and let's see together how faith, grace, and salvation continue to unfold in this amazing letter. Alright, that wraps up today's dive into Romans. I hope you're starting to see how the bad news and the good news fit together, and why understanding both is so important. If you enjoyed this, stick around for the next part of our study. We'll continue unpacking Romans and exploring faith, grace, and salvation even deeper. Don't forget to hit like or subscribe if you want to keep following along. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to continue this journey with you.